A sheriff slapped a waitress in public. Then a Navy SEAL stood up. The diner was loud, lively, and ordinary until the moment it wasn't. It was the kind of roadside place where conversations blended with the clinking of plates and the hum of coffee machines. Truckers laughed near the counter, a family shared fries in a corner booth, and sunlight streamed through the windows, giving everything a palm golden glow. Nothing about that afternoon hinted that, within seconds, everyone inside would witness something they would never forget. Because in just a moment, a single sound would silence the entire room. Welcome to United War, where stories of courage, honor, and unexpected heroes come to life. And this story begins with a waitress no one thought twice about, and a man no one dared question. She moved quickly between tables, balancing plates with practiced ease. Her name tag glinted under the lights as she worked, her expression polite but tired, the look of someone pushing through a long shift. Most customers barely noticed her. To them, she was just part of the background, another worker doing her job. But at the far end of the diner sat a man who demanded attention without even trying. He wore a sheriff's uniform, the badge polished, the posture rigid, the air around him heavy with authority. People glanced at him respectfully, some even nervously. In small towns, a sheriff wasn't just a lawman, he was power. At first, nothing seemed wrong. He drank his coffee slowly, eyes scanning the room like he owned it. When the waitress approached his table, she spoke politely, her voice soft and professional. She asked if he needed anything else. Something about her tone must have irritated him. Maybe it was the delay in service. Maybe it was nothing at all. His chair scraped sharply against the floor as he stood. Conversations nearby began to fade. The waitress blinked, confused, clearly unsure what she had done wrong. Then it happened. The sharp crack echoed through the diner. The sheriff's hand had struck her across the face. Every sound vanished. Forks froze mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the coffee machine seemed to fall silent. The waitress staggered half a step, stunned more by shock than pain, her hand rising slowly to her cheek. Her eyes widened not in anger, but disbelief. No one moved. No one spoke. The sheriff adjusted his sleeve like nothing had happened, his expression cold, as if he'd merely brushed dust off his uniform. The unspoken message hung heavy in the air. Who's going to stop me? And for a moment, it seemed like the answer was no one. Until, from a booth near the window, a chair slid back. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but in the silence it sounded like thunder. A man stood, calm, steady, watching. Most people hadn't even noticed him before. He'd been sitting quietly, eating his meal alone, blending into the background like any ordinary customer. But now, as he rose to his full height, something about his presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. His posture was too straight, his gaze too focused, his presence too controlled. The sheriff turned slightly, sensing movement behind him. And that was the moment everything changed. Because the man who had just stood up wasn't just another customer. He was a Navy SEAL.
The room stayed frozen, as if time itself had paused to watch what would happen next. The sheriff slowly turned, his boots heavy against the tile floor, his expression tightening when he saw the man standing near the window. At first glance, there was nothing flashy about him. No uniform, no badge, no sign of rank, just a quiet man in simple clothes. But there was something else, something unmistakable. It was in the way he stood, balanced, grounded, completely still. It was in his eyes, steady, calm, observant. And most of all, it was in the silence he carried with him. Not the silence of hesitation, but the silence of control. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "Sit down," he ordered, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. The man didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. He didn't even step forward. He simply looked at the sheriff with the same calm expression, as if measuring him, studying him, weighing something invisible. Around them, the diners watched in stunned anticipation. People shifted nervously in their seats. A mother pulled her child closer. One of the truckers lowered his coffee cup slowly, afraid the sound might break whatever fragile balance hung in the air. The waitress stood off to the side, her cheeks still flushed, her breathing shallow. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel it. The tension, the shift, the moment. The sheriff took a step toward the man. Authority radiated off him like heat. He wasn't used to being ignored, not in his town, not in public, not by anyone. "You deaf? I said sit down." Still, the man didn't move. Instead, he spoke. His voice was low, controlled, and steady, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command attention. "You shouldn't have done that." That was it. No threats, no insults, just a simple statement. But somehow those 4 words hit harder than any shout. A ripple passed through the room. People exchanged glances. Something about the way he said it made it clear he wasn't bluffing, and he wasn't afraid. The sheriff scoffed, rolling his shoulders as if loosening up. "You telling me what I should or shouldn't do?" he sneered. "You got a badge? You got authority here?" The man tilted his head slightly, studying him like a puzzle already solved. "No," he replied calmly, "I don't need one." The confidence in his tone made the sheriff hesitate, just for a fraction of a second. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Because the sheriff had seen confidence before, he knew the difference between fake bravado and the real thing, and what stood in front of him now wasn't pretending. A faint murmur spread among the customers. Someone whispered, "Who's that guy?" No one answered. The man finally took one slow step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, just deliberate, the kind of step taken by someone who had already decided how this would end. The air felt heavier with each inch he moved. The sheriff's jaw tightened. His hand twitched slightly near his belt, not reaching, just hovering, like instinct was arguing with pride. The man stopped a few feet away, close enough that there was no ignoring him now. Up close, the difference between them was obvious. The sheriff carried authority because of his badge. The stranger carried authority because of who he was. And then, quietly, almost casually, one of the truckers near the counter whispered the words that changed everything. "That guy's military." Another voice added, barely audible, "Not just military." A pause. "That's a SEAL." The whisper spread like electricity. Heads turned, eyes widened. The realization moved across the diner one person at a time, until it reached the sheriff himself. For the first time since he'd stood up, the sheriff's confidence cracked. Because now he understood something he hadn't before. He hadn't just been challenged. He had just been challenged by someone trained to face danger for a living. And the man in front of him was still standing there, perfectly calm.
The realization settled over the diner like a storm cloud. The whisper had spread, and now everyone knew. The quiet man standing between the sheriff and the stunned waitress wasn't just another customer. He was someone trained for chaos, someone forged in pressure, someone who had faced situations far more dangerous than a loud voice and a shiny badge. The sheriff tried to hide it, but the shift showed. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightened. Authority had always been his shield, but now it felt thinner, like paper instead of steel. The man didn't change his expression. He simply stood there, calm and unshaken, as if the tension around him didn't exist. The room felt smaller somehow,
every eye fixed on the silent standoff unfolding in the center of the diner. "You think that scares me?" the sheriff said, his voice louder now, forced confidence leaking through the edges. "I don't care what you are." The man nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the words, but not the meaning behind them. "That's fine," he said quietly. "You don't have to care." His tone didn't rise, it didn't threaten, but something about it made the sheriff hesitate again. It was the voice of someone who didn't need approval, someone who wasn't trying to win an argument. He was stating a fact. The waitress watched from the side, her eyes darting between them. Her breathing had steadied, but her hands still trembled slightly. She had expected humiliation, maybe anger, maybe embarrassment. She had never expected someone to stand up for her, especially not like this. The sheriff took another step forward, trying to reclaim control of the moment. The badge on his chest caught the light, glinting as if reminding everyone who held authority here. "You're interfering with law enforcement. That's a mistake." The man tilted his head just a fraction. "No, a mistake is thinking no one's gonna step in when you cross a line." Silence. The words didn't echo, but they landed. Hard. Somewhere in the diner, a chair creaked. Someone swallowed nervously. The tension was so thick it felt like the air itself had weight. The sheriff's hand hovered near the belt again, not reaching, just hovering. Instinct, pride, habit, all fighting for control at once. But the man didn't react. He didn't flinch. He didn't even glance down. His focus never left the sheriff's eyes. It was the gaze of someone trained to read intent before it became action. Seconds ticked by. In those seconds, something subtle happened, something most people wouldn't notice. The power in the room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a tide turning. The sheriff felt it. So did everyone else, because authority backed by fear can vanish the moment fear disappears. And right now, the only person in the room who didn't seem afraid was the man standing in front of him. A murmur rose near the counter again. Someone whispered, "He's not backing down." Another voice replied softly, "He doesn't need to." The sheriff exhaled slowly through his nose. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. He wasn't used to resistance. He wasn't used to being challenged. And he definitely wasn't used to being challenged by someone who didn't care about titles or threats. The man finally spoke again. His voice was calm, even, final. "You owe her an apology." Not a suggestion, not a demand shouted in anger. A statement, the kind that left no room for misunderstanding. The diner held its breath, because everyone knew what happened next would decide everything.
The diner went completely still. It wasn't the kind of silence people notice right away. It was the kind that creeps in slowly, until suddenly you realize no one is breathing loudly, no forks are moving, no chairs are scraping. Every person in the room was waiting, watching. The sheriff stared at the man in front of him, his expression tight, his jaw working as if he were chewing on a decision he didn't want to swallow. The badge on his chest gleamed under the lights, but it didn't seem as powerful now, not in this moment, not in front of someone who clearly wasn't impressed by it. The man didn't move. He didn't rush him, didn't repeat himself, didn't threaten. He just stood there, patient. And somehow that patience carried more pressure than any raised voice ever could. The waitress stood near the counter, her hand still resting lightly against her cheek. The sting had faded, but the shock hadn't. Her eyes stayed locked on the scene unfolding in front of her, as if she were afraid to blink and miss it. The sheriff shifted his weight. For a split second, pride flared across his face. You could see it, the instinct to double down, to assert control, to remind everyone who he was. But then he looked again at the man's eyes, and something changed. Because those weren't the eyes of someone looking for a fight. They were the eyes of someone who had already faced worse, someone who didn't bluff, someone who didn't step forward unless he was prepared to stand there as long as it took. The sheriff's shoulders dropped slightly. It was subtle, almost invisible, but everyone saw it. The room seemed to lean closer. Seconds stretched. Then finally, the sheriff spoke. His voice was lower now, rougher, not the booming command it had been before. "Fine." He turned his head toward the waitress. His words came out stiff, like they didn't want to leave his mouth. "Sorry." The word hung in the air. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was enough. The tension broke instantly. A quiet exhale rippled through the diner as if the whole room had been holding its breath together. Shoulders relaxed, hands unclenched. Conversations didn't start yet, but relief settled in. The waitress blinked, surprised. She nodded slowly, still processing what had just happened. The man gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Not proud, not triumphant, just satisfied. The situation had ended the way it should have. No violence, no chaos, just a line drawn and respected. Without another word, he stepped back. The movement was calm, controlled, and final. The moment was over because he decided it was over. The sheriff adjusted his sleeve again, but this time the gesture lacked confidence. He turned, walked toward the door, and left without another glance. The bell above the entrance jingled softly as it closed behind him. Only after he was gone did the room truly come back to life. Murmurs spread, people whispered. Some stared at the man with quiet admiration. Others looked at the waitress with gentle smiles. The man simply returned to his table, sat down, picked up his fork. Like nothing had happened. But everyone knew something had, because they had just witnessed a rare kind of strength, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't boast, and doesn't need recognition. The kind that steps forward only when it matters and steps back the moment the job is done. The waitress glanced at him once more, gratitude shining in her eyes. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. No words, none were needed. And as the normal sounds of the diner slowly returned, one quiet truth lingered in the air. Real authority isn't worn on a badge. Sometimes it walks in silently, stands up at the right moment, and reminds everyone what respect really means.